To save a building is to save a heart, all its chambered memory, all its part in history.
On the northwestern shore of Lake Michigan, in Michigan's Lower Peninsula, lies Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. 68 miles of shoreline enhanced with massive sand dunes, clear lakes, dense beech maple forests, and crystalline streams. And offshore, bathed by the unpredictable waters of Lake Michigan, but part of the park, sit the Manitou Islands, tranquil and uninhabited. And there is more. Somewhat hidden at the northern coastal edge of the park is a historic farm community, dotted with picturesque farmhouses, barns, sheds, and cemeteries. This is the Port Oneida Rural Historic District, recently placed on the National Register of Historic Places, officially recognizing it as a national treasure and a premier site for preservation. This farming community developed in the late 19th century near Port Oneida and Glen Haven, both villages eagerly serving the lumber boom. The villagers were drawn to this area because of the bustling shipping traffic in the Manitou Passage. At picturesque Glen Haven, several buildings are being renovated and adapted for reuse. The Sleeping Bear Inn awaits reuse. And the cannery is now being used to house and display the park's extensive historic Lake Michigan boat collection. And now, through a cooperative initiative between the National Lakeshore and Preserve Historic Sleeping Bear, these weathered farmsteads are entering an exciting new phase. At the Olson Farm, the Park Service and members of Preserve Historic Sleeping Bear are beginning the transformation of this turn-of-the-century farmstead.
It started when the Park Service announced that they didn't have the funds they needed to take care of these historic buildings. When people in the community found out about that, we responded and organized a grassroots group called Preserve Historic Sleeping Bear to help the park preserve the buildings and promote historic preservation.
We formed a partnership with the National Park Service and we're really looking forward to it. We're going to educate the public on what the actual the nature of the buildings are and the vulnerability of them, and we're also going to pull together some partners to try and fill these buildings back up and make them active again.
We, since the beginning of this project, have depended on the kind of local energy that's being displayed in the work that's happening here right now. That's about community participation, business support, and government leadership. And it is a great example of how people can work together and accomplish remarkable goals.
The Port Oneida Rural Historic District is only a part of an extremely diverse historic inventory within the national park. Just a few miles offshore in Lake Michigan, both South and North Manitou Islands reveal the remains of 19th century communities. Lighthouses, life-saving stations, farms, and even old summer cottage clusters. Some have been restored, while some await repair and eventual restoration. They represent the intriguing lighthouse and island architecture that is so reminiscent of early Great Lakes life. Also within the park are several early 20th century structures of great historic interest. The Buckaloo Lodge, a family cabin from the turn of the century, and the Kentucky Inn, a 1920s lodge catering to Michigan's emerging tourist trade. Who would have imagined that tourism would have become such an important part of the region's economy? Farming in Port Oneida at the turn of the century was a hard but tranquil life, and much can be learned from its remaining buildings, its pastures and fields, its fence rows. A measure of prosperity is suggested by the quality of the remaining buildings. The honest, simple proportions and restrained details, all awaiting restoration and new life. An additional treasure is the variety of work and storage sheds, outbuildings, that suggest a very active daily life.
These farms, in addition to big barns and the farmhouses, had a number of small buildings that had a special purpose. And here in Port Oneida, we're lucky we have several of these specialized buildings preserved. As you can see when you get in here, the workbench number of spare parts from everything that's broken over the years, and so this was a workshop where the tools could be repaired, tools made. But this also has a special additional function. Back over in this corner, there's a hearth, which has built into it a cast iron kettle for heating water. Up in the rafters here, there's this big pulley for hoisting heavy objects and hooks along the top. So this building was also used as a butchering shed for butchering cattle and pigs and other livestock on the farm. We're thrilled to have the cooperation and support of the Preserve Historic Sleeping Bear, which will help to raise the funds and the volunteer effort to preserve and maintain these buildings. This is a great area where families can come and explore the landscape, and in the process of seeing this beautiful landscape and exploring it, can also learn a little bit about their agricultural heritage. There are some other parks who have partnerships, but on the scale that we're talking about, with the number of farms in Port Oneida and throughout on the Manitou Islands and other areas of the park, we're looking at something that would be very unusual within the Park Service, to find this much outside partnership participation.
I love the landscape. It's an area that I've played in and hiked in and peeked in those windows for years. It's so near and dear to me. It's just a part of my soul. I'd say that that we wouldn't know what we lost until we lost it. I think that those are the subtle elements that makes the Sleeping Bear Dunes so unique. I would love to see other businesses get involved. It's a resource we can't afford to lose.
The turn-of-the-century barn is an important historic symbol, evoking memories of rugged self-sufficiency and a yearning for simpler times. The barn remains the dominant object in most agricultural landscapes, but because of development and shrinking farmlands, it is fast disappearing.
Michigan barn preservation efforts are focused at providing information about barns and related farm or rural activities, mainly barns. Our emphasis is to try to get information out that's user-friendly, people that can actually get their hands on it, touch it, use it, put it into practice. Keep a roof on your barn, you'll keep the water off regular timbers. They're not pressure-treated timbers, so once those timbers get water on, they start to rot. You have to have a purpose for this larger building, the purpose being whether it be for hay or agricultural use or readaptive use. This represents my culture. I'm one generation removed off the farm, and I never grew up on a farm. I've never had to maintain a barn. I've maintained mini barns for other people, but I look at these buildings and that's my past, and I look at the timbers in those buildings, and that's just not a 150-year-old barn. That's a 350-year-old piece of wood in that barn. That's a cultural icon, also sitting there. That's our roots.
The work has only begun, and while the National Park is positioned to do its part in saving these structures and seeing that many of them will be put to imaginative reuse, Preserve Historic Sleeping Bear also continues its efforts to stabilize, preserve, and put to use these valuable buildings.
Port Oneida is truly exceptional. There are no other rural historic districts listed on the National Register in Michigan.
What's unique about Port Oneida is that we have a collection of 20 historic farms that are within public ownership, so it will stay this way and become more significant year after year.
Preserve Historic Sleeping Bear hopes to accomplish many things by working in partnership with the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. Number one, we are going to pay attention to the management plan as it continues to develop, to make certain that cultural resources like these at Port Oneida get a fair shake. Number two, we are going to encourage the expenditure of National Park Service money in the restoration of buildings here at Port Oneida and elsewhere within the park. And number three, we are going to attempt to raise money in the private sector to bring about changes here. We are also hoping to nurture collaborations between organizations and the National Park Service to reuse some of the buildings.
Well, this project is dependent on citizen participation. We've asked the community to come out and help as volunteers to grab a paintbrush and grab a hammer and help do actual work on the buildings. And at the same time, there's a great opportunity for local businesses to support financially the work and the costs of historic preservation here.